When Ghosts and Goblins hit arcades in 1985, it was a massive success. Though it is now known for its ridiculous difficulty, don't worry, it was still known for it then too. The game was a large technological leap forward for its time, and can be seen as one of the first run-and-gun arcade games, coming out before both Contra and Rolling Thunder. It placed 10th in revenue among fellow coin-ops in Japan, and 9th in revenue in the US in 1986, and was a million seller when it hit consoles and home computers. So not only were sequels inevitable, but so were the spin-offs. The character of Red Armor, however that's pronounced, the nasty little demon that has tormented players with his agility and flight for years, got his first game for the Nintendo Game Boy in 1990, and to differentiate it from its dark quarter-munching cousin, Gargoyle's Quest went in a softer, more RPG-inspired direction, though still very challenging. You not only had side-scrolling levels, but an overhead world map and towns, as well as random encounters. This continued on with a sequel for the NES, and a remake of that sequel for the Game Boy Color that never left Japan, and finally, Demon's Crest in 1994 for the Super NES, which producer Tokuro Fujiwara considered a sort of audition for the kinds of projects he wanted to make for the then-approaching 32-bit consoles. And you can see the evolution present in the shift of art direction from bright and cartoony to dark and macabre, as well as the further emphasis of Metroidvania-style progression and non-linear game structure, which allows you to tackle the game's levels in any order from a very JRPG-esque Mode 7 world map. While the moment-to-moment gameplay is that of a run-and-gun platformer, the gun being your fire breath, you also have an infinite hover and can stick to walls, allowing for much greater mobility than your average platformer protagonist. While these abilities had to be leveled up in previous games, they are maxed out here to shift the focus to other abilities you receive over the course of your quest. Bosses will often leave an item behind that gets added to your roster of moves and attacks, like a claw fireball that creates sticky surfaces on non-climbable walls, or a tornado that you can stand on to leap higher and higher in the air like the bubble wand from Animal Well. You'll even get pieces of the titular Demon's Crest that transform you into other gargoyle forms that have their own abilities, like breathing underwater or a dash and smash. And though this is just speculation, it does seem like certain projectiles do more damage to some bosses than others, in the grand Capcom tradition. Now, the original Ghosts and Goblins was a real jackass when it came to actually completing the game by forcing you to replay through the entire campaign a second time with the difficulty climbing even higher. Demon's Crest will sort of fool you in its own way by unlocking what seems like the final boss after playing through the first 4 levels of the game. If you manage to beat Phalanx, which is not tricky as long as you utilize the claw attack to scale the spike walls and attack him up high, you'll get a bad ending, a roster roll call, and an ending softlock. And maybe some people got this far and then returned the game to their local Blockbuster and thought, well, that was kinda disappointing. Of course, this false ending is almost too obvious, considering you've only got one piece of the Demon's Crest at this point and a whole bunch of blank spaces in your inventory. It's here where the Metroidvania aspect of the game really comes into play, as replaying old stages with those new abilities will reveal new paths and new level exits guarded by new bosses that give you new items and pieces of Crest, which then reveal more of the world map to explore. It's pretty darn cool, and I appreciate that the game doesn't hold your hand in this aspect. You just have to find the rest of the game yourself. In an interview with Famicom Sushin, Fujiwara is asked about players not reaching the true ending and states, "That's actually fine, and is the experience we intended players to have. If a player gets that far and is satisfied, that is of course fine too, but if you feel something is missing or not quite right, for those players, we want them to give it another go." Now, I'm not a game developer, but if I learned that most players never got past the first ending, I'd be a little disappointed. One of my favorite games this year was Master Key. It's one of the best non-Nintendo Zelda games ever made. But when you look at the achievements, only 22.5% of people who own the game have beaten it. And only little over a third have reached the city, which is the last third of the game. Players leaving early is a real nightmare for developers in today's industry. But back in the 90s, your average console rental could vary from a 20-hour RPG to a half-hour beat-em-up, so it's not that crazy for a game to only have a 1-hour runtime, even in 1994. The game's manual, however, clearly lists out the cool abilities you'll receive in the game, many of which are beyond that ending, so hopefully most players stuck with it and kept searching for more, rather than bringing it back to Funko Land and exchanging it for Mr. Nuts. In addition to the new routes, new abilities will help you find the traditional staple of Metroidvanias, the passive permanent stackers. There's items to increase your max HP, flasks to fill with potions, pieces of parchment to write spells on, and talismans to equip for small perks. And so, even though replaying a stage is not the most elegant game design, it's still fun to do because of the new stuff you can find, and each level's relatively short length. What is a little less fun, and just as inelegant however, is the interface. All of your abilities can be accessed and equipped from an item menu, much like changing weapons in a Mega Man game. But for whatever reason, Capcom chose not to utilize the L or R buttons on the controller, so there's no hot swapping while playing. You have to pause every time to change, which is just a bit clumsy in my opinion. If nothing else, the primary fire projectiles should have been hot swappable, no pun intended. And the select button is not used either, not for a map, not for anything. That button could have been used to cycle through your available potions or spells, for example. They could have made the experience a lot less start and stop had they used the full controller. But otherwise, it is fun to control Firebrand, who is on a quest to retrieve the 6 separated pieces of the Demon's Crest, which was stolen away from him by the evil, relatively speaking, Phalanx. By recovering the crest, he hopes to unseat Phalanx from his tyrannical rule of the underworld and get his revenge. While the level design is mostly linear, there is a bit of exploration involved, and the Firebrand's moveset really facilitates that nicely. It's kind of funny to completely trivialize a screen I've been to before by simply getting as high up as possible and floating from left to right above all of the obstacles and enemies. And hey, maybe there'll be something up there. The fire projectiles themselves are a bit of a mixed bag because you can't fire more than 2 at a time until they despawn, and they won't despawn at the screen's edge, so more than once I've missed hitting a boss and then had no ability to attack for a few seconds. Speaking of the bosses, they're nice and varied and generally enjoyable to take down, with the exception of the Flyer, whose faux 3D spinning just made for a lot of timing-based frustration, but I don't like that they got recycled more than once in certain circumstances. While the Ghosts and Goblins games already had a dark and spooky look to them and were very impressive looking for their time, Demon's Crest is on a whole nother level. This is a drop-dead gorgeous game for the Super Nintendo, standing at the transition point between the 16-bit and 32-bit eras. The color work is outstanding, and the interior detail work sometimes outshines even some PS1 platformers. The music is not to my taste, it lacks the catchy melodies of the more memorable Ghosts and Goblins games, but it is at least appropriate to the setting with moody organs, pads, and harpsichords. Fujiwara said that he hoped to one day make a game that people would want to play for the rest of their life, and although Demon's Crest is not quite on that level, it certainly is a game worth playing and replaying, and Takuro certainly made a lot of memorable experiences both at Capcom and after. In addition to the Ghosts and Goblins franchise, he directed Commando, Bionic Commando, and Sweet Home, the game responsible for spawning the survival horror genre. And Fujiwara did pass that 32-bit audition confidently, forming the studio Whoopee Camp and developing one of my top 100 games of all time, Tomba, for the PS1. And you can see his DNA in a lot of the games he directed or produced, with replayability and exploration at the forefront of design. The man's a living legend, and Demon's Crest is just another example of his endless creativity and willingness to experiment. With a runtime average of around 3 to 4 hours, there's really no reason not to dive into this, and it's even available on the Nintendo Switch Online subscription service. Give it a try and let me know what you think in the comments below. Or should I say, give it a fly? No, I shouldn't say that. Thanks for watching this stupid little video, I really appreciate it. Give it a like and subscribe if you want more videos like it. I try to put something out every week. I've also got a Patreon where I put up videos early, and I now have a Discord for fans to hang out and chat, with backer-only streams on the horizon. Until next time, you'll find me in another castle.